a couple of minutes late, but we had a problem with an internet connection. So today is our pleasure to have with us Niall Hughes from King's College, and he's going to talk to us about strategic voting in two-party legislative elections. I'm just going to remind you that the talks normally are about 50 minutes plus 10 minutes for questions. I think you can, Niall is a single author on this paper, so you can ask the question for the chat. We'll pick up the clarification ones and pass them along to him. The seminar takes place every 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, we'll have Vincent Anesi from Luxembourg. I'm just, because we're late, I'm just gonna let Niall get on with it. Please start.
Cool, all right, great. Thanks a lot, Francesco, and thanks a lot everyone for inviting me. Yeah, sorry for not having the camera on, but as you see, we're having issues with internet. So let me just get cracking straight into it. So let's imagine I am a voter and I care about two dimensions, right? I am economically on the right and I'm socially liberal, right? I'm what you might call a Rockefeller Republican, right? What they call them in the US, okay? And then I go to vote in my election and I face these two characters, right? I've got Joe Biden, who's socially liberal and economically left, versus Donald Trump, who's economically right and socially conservative, right? And so I like Trump on the economic dimension and I like Biden on the social dimension, right? And so you can see then I'm conflicted as to who I should actually vote for. And in fact, what I face is I face a choice between two bundles of policies, right? Biden has two dimensions, as does Trump, and I need to pick, okay, I need to choose between those two bundles, right? And so the winner implements their policy on both dimensions. And so me as a conflicted voter, I need to decide, well, I don't like either of them perfectly, so who do I vote for? Well, what's going to determine my decision is my preference intensity, right? So let's suppose that I care more about the economic dimension than I do about the social dimension. Then in this case, in a presidential election in the US, what I'm going to say is, well, I'm going to grin and bear it and vote for Trump because he's the least bad of the two given my preferences, okay? So my preference intensity is going to determine how I vote. Very straightforward, very simple. Okay. Now let's transplant ourselves to a different country and institutional setup. So on the right, you've got Boris Johnson, right, who is economically right and socially conservative. And on the left is a guy you've probably never seen before. His name is Ali Milani, and he was the opponent to Boris in the constituency of Uxbridge and South Ruislip back in December 2019. Okay, he is a Corbynite, hard left, and socially liberal as well. So you can see the parallels here, right? They're both, it's essentially the same choice I faced before with Biden and Trump. But what's different? Well, now I'm voting in a legislative election, right? And I don't care about who wins my district per se. What I care about is what policy is going to be implemented. Right? So the winner of this constituency doesn't implement the policy. He's just one of 650 guys that goes to parliament, right? So I care about policy, not who my MP is per se. Right? And so what I want to influence is, well, how do I influence what policies get implemented? That is by determining what is the legislative majority. Right? And so in a sense, I need to think, when does my district matter? Well, my district is going to matter when the winner from my district flips what the majority is in parliament, right? Whether it switches it from being a left party majority to a right party majority, say, on the economic dimension, or whether it flips the majority, who has the majority on the social issues dimension, right? And so that's the only way in which my district is going to influence policy. And so in a sense, I need to really think about when my district is pivotal, right, at a national level. And so let's continue the thought experiment. We would then need to think, well, when does my district matter, right? It could be pivotal on the economic dimension. It could be pivotal on the social dimension. But I need to weigh that by my preferences. And let's suppose it's more likely that my district is going to be pivotal on the social dimension. So then I've got one thing in my utility function saying, well, I prefer the economic dimension, so I should go for Boris, just like I went for Trump. but this pivotality thing is pointing me in the other direction, saying I should vote on the social dimension. And so as it turns out, as you vote in an election with a large number of voters, pivotality is going to trump preference intensity, right? And so in this case, even though I care more about the economic dimension, my best response is going to be to vote for this Ali Milani guy and vote on the social dimension, right? And so you see that the contrast between the two scenarios, even though we had similar candidates, my voting, my best response is going to be different because we're in different institutional setups, okay? So you might say, okay, who cares, right? I've talked about being a Rockefeller Republican, you know, a conflicted voter. And you might say, well, you know, in reality, there's very few types of these people, right? Most people are, you know, liberal on both dimensions or conservative on both dimensions. And so if a few people are voting strategically or changing their votes, will that really matter? Will that really change any of the outcomes? And second, you could say, well, you know, even if that is so, if the candidates are being strategic when they're choosing their policies, maybe the platforms are already reflecting the preferences of most voters, right? And so whether some voters are strategic or not is not going to matter. Maybe we'll just get good policies anyway. And then a third kind of call for concern is that, well, if I'm saying in a legislative election, you should ignore everything but one dimension, right? You should only focus on the most likely pivotal dimension, then maybe you're going to end up with some suboptimal policies, right? Maybe you focus on one dimension, but you get some bad policies in other dimensions, okay? And so there's a note of caution there starting out, which I'm going to then counter with saying, you know what, actually, the difference between legislative and single districts, it does matter, right? And what I find is it matters quite a lot, right? Even though you might only have a few conflicted voters. And there's a bunch of different results, but I'll kind of tag them into two kind of silos. And the first case is that outcomes in a legislative election are more predictable than they are in a single district election, right? Why is that so? Well, it's because in a single district election, what happens, the equilibrium is that candidates are going to play a matching pennies game. They're going to randomize their policies, right? And so we can end up in a scenario where, you know, good policies aren't even chosen, right? Or are not even on the ballot. Right? And so you can have cases where for the same distribution of voter preferences, we can get very different platform winners, very different implemented policies. Right? Whereas what I'm going to show is in a legislative election, the platforms, the winners, the implemented policies are all uniquely pinned down by voter preferences. Right? And so we get a much more clear mapping from preferences to outcomes than we would in a single district, which I think is somewhat interesting because, you know, when we think about strategic versus sincere voting, right, traditionally you tend to think of, well, you know, sincere voting, at least you know what you get, right? Everybody votes for their favorite guy or something like that, and then the outcome will be predictable, right? Whereas with strategic voting, you can have lots of different equilibria that people will coordinate on, and it could be a mess. Whereas here, I'm saying exactly the opposite in a sense, right? If you have sincere voting in a single district, you're going to get random outcomes, right? Non-predictable outcomes, whereas you'll have strategic voting in a legislative election, and that will give you unique policy outcomes, right? It'll pin down equilibria exactly. So that's one dimension in which legislative, I say, better than single district. And then the other dimension is that in a legislative, I show that in a legislative election, policy is more representative than it would be in a single district. Right? That is the final outcome that's implemented is preferred by a majority of districts on each dimension. Right? And a Condorcet winner will win if it exists. These might seem like very basic properties of any voting rule, but as it turns out, they're not satisfied for a single district. Right? In a single district, you can have plenty of bad outcomes and non-welfare maximizing outcomes happen. And what I show is that by actually, in some sense, complicating the game more by moving it into a legislative election, you end up with more representative policies. And just to give you some, I see there's a question there, but first I'll just finish this. To give you a sense of why policy is more representative in legislative rather than single district, if you go back to the idea of Trump versus Biden, right? Trump knew that I cared more about he knows that I care more about the economy than social dimensions. So he knows he has me in his pocket, right? He doesn't need to respond to my preferences. He knows that he can count on my vote no matter what. Whereas we saw that, and because of that, Trump will then focus his attention on trying to get the swing voters on the other dimension, right? He'll try and catch people on the social dimension because he knows he can rely on the core economic voters. Whereas in the Boris example, right, we saw that even though I had the same preferences, right, I care more about the economy than social, we saw a case where I'm going to abandon Boris and vote for the left-wing guy, right? And so Boris knows that he can't rely on me, and so he needs to be a lot more concerned and a lot more attentive, let's say, to my preferences. Right? And so overall, basically, in the legislative model, candidates are much more attuned to voter preferences rather than just trying to get a share of swing voters. And so that's why we end up with more representative policies. So a question, should I answer now? I can answer now. The presidential election is via electoral college. Is it like legislative or why not? So yes, I'm taking a shortcut here where in my examples, I'm supposing, let's suppose the US is just one big election, right? Vote for candidate A or candidate B. Of course, in reality, we know it's not that straightforward, but these are kind of, you know, they don't call it models for nothing. But yeah, good question. Of course, you know, everything comes with a grain of salt in terms of reality. So quick overview then, what do? I build a model of legislative elections with strategic voters, strategic candidates. There's going to be 2 candidates in each district, and there's going to be 2 binary dimensions of policy. Right? And one dimension is going to be fixed. Okay, well, I'll give you more details on that in a second. Why am I interested in doing this? First of all, I generally think that, you know, the most important elections are multi-district elections, right? In most countries, that's where the most important policymakers are determined. For example, US Congress, you know, in any Westminster system, legislatures are very important and I feel somewhat understudied. The second point is that, you know, traditionally we focus on just one dimension, right? Left versus right, Downesian kind of framework. But, you know, recently this has been cross-cut with other dimensions, right? We can think of pro and anti-Brexit, pro or anti-globalization, socially liberal and conservative, et cetera, right? So it seems that more and more things and voter preferences don't exactly just all collapse onto one dimension. There's something interesting to be studied there in looking at more than one dimension. And so, you know, given that this hasn't been looked at before, right, what are some interesting questions I want to look at is, well, how should a voter vote in this kind of setup, right, with 2 dimensions in legislative election? Is there even an equilibrium, and is it unique? And then can we say something about, you know, are legislative elections better or worse than single district ones, right? So that's kind of why I think you should be interested, at least why I am. And just to very quickly situate it in the literature, right, there's a whole page worth of different you know, papers you could look at. I'm not going to go through them in detail. Just to look at the first 2 branches of the literature, right? The top one is 2 parties, 1 dimension of policy and multiple districts. And the second one is similar, it's 2 parties, but multiple dimensions of policy and a single district. What I'm doing is basically mashing those 2 together, right? Say, let's look at 2 parties, 2 dimensions and multiple districts, right? And that hasn't been done before, right? And so what's interesting there, I've put the Kraza and Polborn in red because essentially what they do, it's a great paper, is what I'm doing today for a legislative election. They did it for a single district election and they came out with lots of kind of bad welfare results, let's say, right? Telling us why single districts in this setup are not good. And so mine kind of serves as a counter to that and a comparison. What literatures otherwise do I speak to? Obviously, it's a big literature on strategic voting. And I've highlighted my own one there just because that's kind of the methods and the techniques I use in this paper build on that. Right? If you're in that's a paper though with 3 parties in a legislative election with strategic voters, in case you're interested in that. And yeah, we also touch on, you know, broader literatures on how do institutions affect policy outcomes, right? So the big questions that people have talked about before. Any questions at this point, or I'll move on to the model?
No questions.
All right, cool. So what's the setup? So there's capital D, odd districts, an odd number of districts, and each is going to select a candidate by majority rule. Each district has a left and a right candidate, and each candidate must decide whether to run in support of a reform or against. Okay. The candidates simultaneously choose their platforms to maximize the probability of winning the seat. And so then there's just notation that each candidate chooses an anti-reform platform with probability mu. Okay. And so once they've chosen their platforms, so you've got, in each district, one guy is fixed at being the left guy, one guy is fixed as being the right. Their only choice is whether to be pro or anti-reform. And so once they've chosen their platforms, the voters, you're then going to have, one of four cases in your district, right? Either they're both anti-reform, both pro-reform, or one is pro, one is anti. Once every district elects someone, that'll give you a seat distribution in the legislature, right? So you'll have a certain number of guys who are left and anti-reform, a certain number who are left and pro-reform, and so on and so forth. And then what are we interested in? We're interested in final policies, which we'll call Z, right? And so the final policy could be any one of four things, right? It could be that the final policy is left and anti-reform, left and pro-reform, right and anti-reform, so on and so forth, right? And how is final policy determined? It's just simple, separate majority votes, right? So everybody sits in the chamber, they vote, are we going to elect, are we going to be left or right on the economic dimension? Are we going to be, and then are we going to be pro-reform or anti-reform? Right? And every MP who's elected, there's full policy commitment, right? So if they're elected on a platform, that's how they're going to vote when they're in the legislature. You could think, of course, of other rules of how policy will be implemented in the legislature. Maybe there'll be a party whip, or maybe it's the majority within a party and so on. Those are all valid things and extensions and other ways you could go. But this is the most straightforward one I could think of. And so you should think of it as kind of, the pro or anti-reform dimension is kind of a free vote, right? You're not restricted within your party. You can cross party lines.
Niall, can I ask for clarification here? So
sure.
Because the platforms are probabilities, when you talk about full policy commitment, what I would interpret that to be would be that if you're elected, you are pro-reform in the parliament with that probability, or against reform with that probability, not that you commit to one or the other, right? So how does this, maybe the timeline here is important.
Good question. Yeah, so in a sense, these candidates are playing a game where they choose their reform, whether they're pro or anti-reform, with a probability, but then they in a sense flip their coins, and then whether it's heads, they've chosen pro, or tails, it's anti, and then once that's decided, that's what they're fixed on, right? So if I had probability 0.8 of being pro reform, and then I actually ended up choosing a pro-reform policy to be my platform, then that's what I'd be stuck to, right? So your actual...
But the voters see the probabilities. They don't see the outcomes of the realizations.
No, they see the realizations, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. So why is it a probability instead of just being... Okay, I guess
because it's you'll see, maybe it's a probability because there could be mixed strategies where the two guys, because it's a simultaneous game, it ends up being matching pennies, and they're trying to chase each other and so on. But in fact, what the voters will never see any kind of probability of being this way or that way.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But
I have a question here. There's some asymmetry between left-right choice or not choice, because it's not a choice, and yes-no choice. So left-right in every district, there is definitely a left and right party, but not for the other one. Why is this asymmetry? Is this for technical reason, or?
A couple of reasons. I mean, one is that you can think of, well, there are some things that are just tough to shift, right? You can't, decide, if you're a politician, you state your claim, you're either a left or a right guy. You can't just flip-flop at every election, right? So, there are some things that we think are fixed and cannot be chosen by candidates, right? You could think of instead, I don't know, race or something else, but typically party is one of those things. Second reason is that, as I mentioned, this other paper, this Krasa and Polborn, that does it for a single district. I kind of wanted things to be as comparable as possible, right? To say, okay, let's fix that and see what happens here. And then a third reason is that, yeah, if you let everything be freely chosen, everything would get very boring, right? Both candidates would just choose the majority position on both dimensions. You'd end up in a kind of Downsian, everybody chooses the same thing and nothing interesting happens kind of world.
But this left-right choice, this is not related to being a member of the party and therefore some kind of party discipline later on in the legislative.
You can think of it as being part of a party, but the second dimension that we're interested in, this pro or anti-reform, doesn't have any whipping, right? So you can imagine, for example, I can be in the left party and I get whipped on 90% of topics, and that tells us about that left versus right dimension. But then there's 10% of topics which are not whipped, and that's our second dimension of freedom.
Okay,
so
thanks.
It has different interpretations, and I know I kind of mix parties with the economic dimension and various things, but yeah. Okay, so that's the candidates. The voters, what do the voters look like? Well, you've got, I'm doing it kind of graphically here, but you can see here's a square, and here's the 4 points of the 4 corners of the square tell you what the 4 potential policies are. Right? And so what we have is 8 different types of voters, depending on your distance from those policies. So for example, this guy here, type of voter YL, right? He prefers the policy left Y is his favorite, right? And then his second favorite is or Y, his third favorite is LN, and his fourth favorite is ORN, right? So it's just his preferences depending on the distance he is. And so you can see a type YL and a type LY are different only in that they have different intensity of preferences, right? Both of them like YL better than everything else, but they differ in what their second favorite thing is, okay? And so that's just saying the same thing I've shown you graphically, right? There's 8 types of voters. That's their preferences, right? Which I think are easier to see graphically, which is why I showed them like that. What do voters know? They know the distribution of preferences in each district, right? These Fs, these are the distribution of preferences that voters are drawn from. And they know also what are the chosen platforms of candidates in every district, right? So quite a bit of information. The number of voters in every district is not known, but it's a plus on random variable with mean K, which is not, this is just a technical thing to make sure we get some kind of randomness, right, in the, and makes everything a lot easier to calculate, to be honest. Voting is costless. So what do the voters do? They either vote left or they vote right. Now, a district is only going to matter when it's pivotal, right? That is when the winner in the district changes the policy chosen in the legislature, right? So we can call PIV in district D between Z and Z prime is when, well, Z is enacted if you elect the left candidate and Z prime if you elect the right. And so then similarly, you can think about there being 8 different pivotal events. And I'm going to show you a picture again, because I think that makes it a bit clearer rather than trying to think how all of these things work, right? So here's an example of a legislature with 11 districts, right? And so it's broken up into 4, where you're saying, well, on the x-axis, you have the number of seats for the right party. On the y-axis, you have the number of seats for pro-reform, for yes. And so, you know, in the top left, you've got a majority for left and yes. So therefore, that's implemented. Similarly, in the 4 other quadrants, right? It's just telling you what the policy will be. And that's for, I've given you an example of a legislature with 11 districts, okay? And then, well, when would you be pivotal? Well, you need to say, well, if we have 11 districts, I need to say, well, what can happen in the other 10 districts such that I'm pivotal, right? Well, it might be that before I vote, you know, 5 of them are pro-reform and 5 are anti-reform. And so I'm pivotal on this reform dimension, right? And so I could be pivotal having a left majority, but on the yes-no reform. I could be pivotal having a right majority, but on the yes-no reform. Or I could be pivotal on the left-right majority, right? Either pro or anti-reform. You've got at the center these double pivotal events where if my district was simultaneously pivotal on both dimensions. I am going to ignore those. I ignore them in the paper. It's an assumption that voters do not condition on those because their probabilities are so small. I have some numbers that I crunch in the paper, but I like to liken it to the fact that, you know, it's like a coin toss, right? Landing on heads or tails versus landing on the side of the coin, right? The probability of being doubly pivotal is so much smaller than being pivotal in either direction that voters ignore this probability. Now, a voter's best response is to vote. He's got a gain function, right? And they want to vote for the left party if this gain function is positive, and for the right party if it's negative, right? And so this is just going to be what? The utility differential in each particular case times the probability of being pivotal in that event, right? And so I told you there was 8 different pivotal events, but we were ignoring 2. And so this is your gain function, right? And so is it positive? Is it negative? That'll tell you how to vote. And a voter is going to be conflicted if they've got positive and negative elements to this function. Okay, so they like one guy in one scenario and the other in a different scenario. So what's the timing? Well, nature draws a population of voters from each district's distribution function. In each district, candidates choose whether to support or oppose the reform. Then in each district, voters elect a single legislator by majority rule. By majority rule, and then the final policy is chosen by 2 separate majority votes. Okay. What is the equilibrium concept? Well, it's going to consist of, we're going to have a voting equilibrium and a candidate equilibrium. Right? And in the voting equilibrium, each voter type in each district best responds to the strategies of all other voters in all districts. While in the candidate equilibrium, the individual candidates best respond to the strategy of the local opponent and the voters in their district. Okay. And there's some restrictions here. I restrict attention to responsive candidate equilibria, right? And so that's where platforms minimally respond to voter preferences. What I want to avoid there is the case where, you know, all of them are choosing the same thing on the reform dimension, and because everyone else does that, therefore I do it. It's these kind of typical voting problems where, you know, if my district doesn't matter, then who cares? We'll all vote the same way on the reform dimension. And the second thing is that we're interested in large elections, so we're going to analyze a set of equilibria as the number of voters goes to infinity, right? And so this is going to be restricting attention to asymptotic, strictly perfect equilibria. Okay, so the other thing this does is it makes sure the equilibrium is robust to any epsilon changes in player strategies, right? So we're not going to have knife edge equilibria. Okay, any questions on that before I jump into results? I believe I have, is it about 20 minutes left, Francesco?
Yeah, I'll give you a few minutes more if you need to, because there's no question.
Okay, good. Everyone perfectly understands.
Sorry? May I ask a question?
Sure.
So, is it that what's the timing? So they're all making their choices at the same time, both candidates or voters, or is there someone going first?
So yeah, good question. The candidates go first. So the candidates, they know the distribution of that voters are drawn from. So they know, you know, how many voters on average there'll be in each district and their preferences and so on. So they, knowing that, simultaneously in each district make their decisions on whether to be pro or anti-reform. And then the voters observe the choices of the candidates, whether in each district they've been pro or anti-reform, and then the voters all vote simultaneously, right? Which I guess is what happens in a general election, right? First people announce platforms, then voters go and vote. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. All right, so what happens in the voting equilibrium, right? Well, straight in is a result to say, as the number of voters goes to infinity, right? Voters in a district vote solely based on the most likely pivotal event, right? This comes straight out of the fact that we're using a Poisson framework, right? And it builds on Myerson's previous work and my work I was telling you about earlier, which is to say, you know, as the number of voters gets large, all you should care about is that most likely pivotal event. Right? And I'll bring you back to the gain function just to give you the idea behind that, right? You know, there's various different events I should care about, right? But as the number of voters goes to infinity, the probability of being pivotal in any of these events goes to 0. But crucially, they all go to 0 at different speeds, right? And so conditional on being pivotal, all of the probability of being pivotal is going to be concentrated in just one of these 6 events, right? And so it's going to say all you need to care about is the single most likely pivotal event and ignore everything else. And that makes our life much easier, right, for the rest of the analysis, right? But this is, I think, at least interesting in itself, because what does it mean? It says, well, your relative intensity of preferences over issue does not matter at all for how you vote, right? So I might care 99% about the economic dimension or about whatever the left-right dimension, but if the other dimension is the one that's more likely to be pivotal, that's how I should vote. And the second implication of this, which I'm going to show you in the next slide, is that every type of voter is a potential swing voter, right? Which is not true at all in a single district. And so this is the equilibrium behavior of each voter type, right? So along here, you've got what type of different districts you have, right? And so if the 2 candidates are aligned on the reform dimension, if they choose the same policy on the reform dimension, then obviously everyone just votes based on, well, do I prefer left or do I prefer right? Similarly, if they're not aligned on the reform dimension, but left versus right is the most likely pivotal event, then everyone just votes on the left-right dimension, right? And so anyone who prefers left votes left, anyone who prefers right votes right. The action happens down here, right, where they're not aligned. This is a case where they're not aligned on the reform dimension, and the reform dimension is the one that's most likely to be pivotal, right? Then, well, if you prefer, if you're anti-reform, you'll vote for the left guy, and if you're pro-reform, you'll vote for the right guy. Whereas in this next case, right, the left guy is pro-reform, the right guy is anti-reform. In that case, anyone who's pro-reform will vote left, anyone who's anti-reform will vote right. And what you can see by looking at this is, particularly these last 2 rows, it's completely the opposite, right? There's no voter type who always votes left or always votes right, right? Who you're going to vote for depends on what scenario you're in, specifically what everyone else in every other district is doing, right? And so everybody is a potential swing voter, right? There's no safe voters for a candidate. Secondly, you see that preference intensity doesn't matter, right? So look at this guy, TNL and TLN, right? They have the same kind of preferred outcome of left and no reform, but they have different preference intensities, right? One guy cares more about the reform dimension, one guy cares more about left, right. But you see in every scenario, these guys always vote the same way, right? Here they always vote the same way, here they always vote the same way, here they always vote the same way. It's the same for any 2 pairs, right? So preference intensity is irrelevant for what you will do, okay? So that's what happens in the voting equilibrium. And now we take that and we move 1 step back up in backward induction to say, okay, well, what will the candidates do? Well, the candidates know the distribution of voter preferences, and they anticipate how voters in each district will vote in each scenario, right? They've seen the table on the last slide. And so when choosing their platforms, they know this, but they don't know whether voters will condition on the left-right dimension or the reform dimension. Right? And that just comes directly out of it was focusing on responsive equilibrium. Right? But what do the candidates know? They know that their platform choice only matters, right, if voters are going to focus on the reform dimension. Right? Because if they focus on the left-right dimension, it doesn't matter what platform they've chosen on the reform dimension. Right? And so the candidates are going to behave as if what matters is the reform dimension. And what comes out of that is that the candidate equilibrium is uniquely pinned down by local voter preferences, right? This might seem obvious, but it wasn't ex ante, right? It might have been that, if voters were conditioning on left versus right, a candidate would do one thing, while as if voters were conditioning on the reform dimension, they'd do something else. And so candidate strategies might depend on what's going on in lots of other districts, right? But actually, the game becomes much simpler, and all they need to focus on is what's happening in their own district. Well, what happens? What is the actual equilibrium? Right? Well, it falls into 2 different sets, right? So there's pure strategy equilibrium, and it's all completely pinned down by voter preferences, right? So if the reform majority is larger than the left or right majority, then both candidates run on the same reform platforms, and voters base the decision on the left-right dimension. Okay, that makes a bit of sense. Okay, so they both choose the same on the reform dimension, and so because they've chosen the same, voters ignore that dimension and vote based on left versus right. Then there's also mixed strategy equilibrium. Right? That occurs when the left or right majority is larger than the reform majority. Right? What happens there is you're going to have a matching pennies game. Right? So the guy, whoever's the advantaged candidate, right? Suppose it's the left guy, right? If he's advantaged, he's going to want to choose the same reform policy as the other candidate, right? So that he has a bigger advantage on that left versus right dimension. But of course, the guy who's disadvantaged wants to choose the opposite thing, right? And so you have a matching pennies game there. Now, what's interesting is that as the number of voters goes to infinity, these mixed strategies actually converge to pure strategies. The advantaged candidate chooses the majority reform position, and the disadvantaged candidate chooses the minority reform position. Right. And so this was something that was quite surprising at the time when I found it, because this mixed strategy equilibrium is the main type of equilibrium in a single district, right? And it doesn't converge to pure strategy equilibrium. In a single district, you're always going to have mixed strategies, right? Whereas in a legislative election, they actually converge to pure strategies, right? And so the outcomes are going to be pinned down by voter preferences.
Niall, we have a question from Konstantin. I think he was one. So the question is, what is the main difference between dimensions? Are they not symmetric? I think it goes back to the point about, voter strategies again, but.
Yeah, no, good question. Yeah, they're not. I mean, in terms of voter preferences, they can be, I can have any kind of distribution of voter preferences across the two dimensions that I want. It doesn't matter. But in terms of are we not treating them symmetric? The only difference between left and right and the reform, anti-reform is that candidates are fixed on left and right. So I'm just in my district. I am the left guy. I face a right guy, and my only choice is to be pro-reform or anti-reform. Right? And so that's the only choice variable I have. Voters, don't care more about one dimension than another or anything. It's fine. So the only difference is just how much flexibility the candidates have. Cool.
Can I also have a question related to what is actually a legislative thing? If you have 3 districts, that already counts as legislative?
Yeah.
So the difference is between 1 and 3, because it's odd as far as I understand. And then whether it's 3 or 5 or infinity, then it doesn't matter as long as k goes to infinity.
Yeah, so k is the number of, so there's 2 things, I guess, right? K is the number of voters in each district, and then D is the number of districts, right? And so there's different things you could play with. My results just say, let's fix the number of districts we have, and in each one increase the number of voters. Right?
The big difference is between D equal 1 and D equal 3.
Yes, the only thing I would say, I would caution against D equal 3 in small legislatures, because my assumption on dropping double pivotal events is would be with a huge loss of generality if you had a small legislature.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. This anyway just tells you what is the outcome of the candidate equilibrium for any distribution of preferences. It's not that interesting, but it just tells you that it's exactly pinned down for any distribution of voter preferences. It'll tell you what will happen. Right? The top 2 are pure strategy equilibria. The bottom 2 are these mixed strategy ones that converge to pure. Right? Okay, and so with all of that in tow, we can actually get on to some of the key results. What are the properties? What are we interested in? Well, the first one there is that as the number of voters goes to infinity, the advantaged candidate chooses the reform policy position preferred by the majority of voters in the district, with probability going to 1. Right? And this advantaged candidate wins the district with probability going to 1. Okay, so one guy, either the left or right guy, has an advantage, and he's going to choose the majority position on the other dimension as well. Right? He's going to either choose it in a pure strategy equilibrium or in a mixed strategy one, which converges to pure. Right? But basically, one guy is going to have the majority position on both dimensions. Right? And obviously, as we're going to be voting, we're either going to be focusing on one dimension or the other when we're voting. This guy who has the best policy on both dimensions is going to win. Right, as the number of voters goes to infinity. And so that tells you that you're going to get a good outcome in any individual district. Right, the winner is going to be the majority preferred on each dimension. And then what you can do is wrap that up to say, well, we get a good outcome in a single district, but that very neatly just corresponds and wraps into getting a good policy nationally, right? So as the number of voters goes to infinity, the unique expected policy that we'll have in the legislature is that which is preferred by the median of median voters on each policy dimension, right? And that just stems from simply the fact that we have majority votes in the legislature, and each individual legislature is the majoritarian guy for that district on both dimensions, right? So for example, the policy ZLN can only be implemented if a majority of districts prefer left to right and a majority prefer no to yes. Okay, so far so good news. Here's another little bit of good news. We know that a Condorcet winner is a policy that would win a pairwise majority vote against any other, right? And we need to come up with a slightly different definition for a legislative case, right? Because it doesn't perfectly map in, right? And I'm going to say that a legislative Condorcet winner is a policy Z such that if it faces any other policy Z prime in every district, then Z would win a majority of seats, right? And so this, I believe, keeps the flavor of the definition of a Condorcet winner, but transposing it to a different setting, right, of a legislature. And with those in mind, what is the result? Well, is that if a Condorcet winner policy exists in a district, it is the expected winner, right? It will always be implemented in a district. And if a legislative Condorcet winner exists, it is the expected implemented policy, right? And so if these good policies exist locally or nationally, they will always be implemented. Okay. And again, all of this stuff might seem very boring or straightforward, but the whole benefit of it is the fact that none of these things are guaranteed for a single district at all, right? We get bad results in a single district, and these good results are coming out of the fact that we have a legislative setup. So I managed to actually get through a bit quicker than I thought, and so I didn't go into detail on these, but I can chat about them if anyone wants later. Additional results we have in the paper is that I compare a presidential system, a crude version of a presidential system versus a parliamentary system, right? And to say, well, which is better, right? And well, based on what we've just seen, you can imagine where my result is going to go there, which is that yes, a parliamentary system is going to lead to on the condition that the national median voter is the same, has the same kind of identity as the median voter in the median district, right? Then welfare is going to be higher in a parliamentary system than a presidential system, right? And the reason is exactly this kind of what I've been saying, is that, you know, in a presidential, say, one big district model, right? You've got these two dimensions of policy, but they're treated as one bundle. And so you can have suboptimal policies, right? That will be implemented. Whereas in the parliamentary system, we're only going to focus on one dimension at a time. And by doing that, it incentivizes the candidates to choose better policies. And so I think it's somewhat counterintuitive, right? You think, well, a presidential election, if you have one big direct election, you think you would get a good policy outcome, right? Which is representative. Whereas if you have, you know, a legislative system that's kind of more removed from that, and you're you know, indirect, a more indirect democracy, you would think that would be more difficult. But it's exactly the fact that because we have these multiple dimensions to policy, it pays off to actually have a parliamentary rather than a presidential system. And then secondly, I look at voter polarization, right? Look at it under single district election and a legislative election. You know, if we change the preferences of voters, is that going to change things much? And what I show is that, you know, if voters become more extreme in a legislative election, right, they care more, for example, about you know, they keep their preferences in terms of they like left and anti-reform, but they become more anti-reform or something, or they become more extreme on one dimension than another. Will that change anything? And in a legislative election, it won't, because remember, your preference intensity doesn't affect how you vote. And so whether if voter preferences become more extreme, this isn't actually going to change anyone's behavior. While in a single district election, it will change behavior and will change outcomes, which may make things worse and may make things better. It all depends on your starting point in a single district. But what we know is, you know, we already know from above that we're going to have a legislative election is better to begin with. So, you know, that's kind of both of these point in favor of legislative elections rather than single ones. And then just a very quick summary, right? Well, what did we find? Well, in terms of voters, we show that voting is strategic, right? Who you vote for is going to depend on, well, what other voters and candidates are doing in other districts, right? All voters are potential swing voters. We showed that preference intensity is irrelevant for how you vote. In terms of the candidates, we saw that platforms are entirely pinned down by voter preferences. And then in terms of policies, we got some positive results that the winning candidate in each district will have a platform preferred by a majority of voters on each dimension. This then pulls through to a national level where the implemented policy is preferred by a majority of voters in a majority of districts to any alternative. And then finally, the implemented policy is going to be a Condorcet winner if it exists, right? And so some of these things, the punch to all of these is the fact that none of those things on this slide are guaranteed in a single district election, right? None of these properties hold in a single district election. And so that's kind of where the punch is, if you will. And so at that, I will leave it there and can open it to questions.
Okay, thank you, Niall. And yes, you started late and you finished early, so that's
great.
Kudos from me. Okay, if anybody has any questions, please just unmute yourselves and ask.
There's a question in the chat from Ivan.
Ivan, you want to ask live, or should we just read the question?
No, it's fine. I was asking, but now I see that this doesn't hold in single district elections. My question was that if all those results, when comparing presidential with parliamentary elections, are only when discussing majoritarian systems.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'd answer it by saying, yeah, that's somewhat what motivates me in doing this kind of research. Is that I don't know what anyone else thinks, but often when you're reading the literature on presidential versus parliamentary systems, it's kind of almost one and the same as the literature on plurality versus pure. They get mashed together, and you can the lines get very blurred, right? And so, which is why I'm saying one of the areas which I do research in and find very interesting that I think is understudied is exactly, looking at legislative elections within a majoritarian system, right? There isn't actually that much done on that. Generally, we look at either, a legislative PR system where there's two parties, or we look at a kind of single district two-party system, right? Whereas looking at a majoritarian system in a legislative setting is something which I think, has plenty of fertile ground.
Okay.
All right. Thanks.
Anybody else? Because I have a question, but if I'm going to leave it for last if other people are here. Okay, maybe I'll get the ball rolling. So Niall, if I think about your results and I think about the British system, I think it's one of the things. If you were a Remainer in the last few years, particularly the last Boris Johnson election, the impression is that the system really sort of allowed the form of hard Brexit that we eventually ended up getting, because the opposition was fractioned between more than two parties. So here I'm introducing more than one party. And actually, you could argue that had this been a presidential system, so that somehow at the end, there would have been one candidate against the other, it would have been easy to predict that one of the two candidates would have been anti-Brexit, or at least pro-soft Brexit. And given the numbers in the polls, that candidate might have actually won the election, because this was such a polarizing issue that most people probably voted on that dimension. So in a way, what I've just described is a case where perhaps things went exactly the opposite way, right? And I think part of it is because sometimes there are multi-party, so competition is not just two parties, right? And this was part of the issue. I don't know if you have, I mean, I can see how introducing multiple parties in your districts might make the model borderline intractable, but I'm wondering whether you had any ideas about this.
Yeah, good question. You know, my cheeky answer would be to say, yeah, we got bad results out of you know, quote unquote bad results out of UK elections because voters don't know my model, right? They were not voting on the dimension on which they were more likely to be pivotal, right? I think people, you know, when election time comes around, people get scared into, you know, you have to vote on basically get scared on voting on the left-right dimension or something, right? And or people would say, you know, oh, I'm not going to vote Corbyn on that dimension, but well, Corbyn was never going to get in anyway. But if you vote for a Remain guy, maybe you would have enough Remain majority to stop it. Or, for example, you know, imagine if you're an anti-Tory guy, but your local Tory guy is pro-Remain. You know, not enough people actually swallowed their pride and voted on that other dimension. And so, you know, I'm not sure.
Well, I mean,
I'm not sure, you know, I think the three-party thing has something to do with it as well, but I think, you know, there's probably lots of reasons why we ended up where we did.
So, but I guess the example was that you haven't thought about, I mean, with this thing, could you find a way to make a system where winning a district doesn't imply necessarily having a majority in that district? Would it be tractable? Could you actually, you think, come up with a version of the model? Because I think that would actually test my story in a way. Right? I mean, I think the difficulty would be trying to think about what happens when you have three parties in the legislature. But at district level, you could just have that plurality wins, and plurality, you can characterize the plurality of being pivotal pretty easily. So I think
you would have lots of multiple equilibria, of course, once you have multiple candidates in every district. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to. I mean, as you know, as I mentioned earlier, I have a paper on three-party strategic voting in legislative elections, but it's not in this two-dimensional model. Right? Yeah. My sense is, and it doesn't allow strategic policy choices by candidates, right? And yeah, I guess my sense is that it would become fairly unwieldy because you'd have to, or at least the assumptions you'd have to make in order to make it work would become a bit too tricky, let's say. But I think it's definitely worth looking at and thinking about once this is done, let's say.
Okay,
Niall, I have a quick question following up a bit on what Francesco was saying.
Hi, Clement.
Hi. What I find really cool in that paper is the fact that you managed to bring back strategic voting even with two candidates, which normally you don't have. Mm-hmm. And so it feels like I'm trying to get my head around why is it that you can recover that? And in some sense, is it the same intuition as strategic voting under three candidates? So now you want to avoid the worst option by voting for the least bad option. And here you introduce this least bad option by having like 4 combination of choices instead of just 2 choices. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, I'm trying to think of the comparison. I guess, where it's very different in terms of, say, a multi-party strategic voting is typically when you have multi-party strategic voting, there's multiple equilibria, right? For any preference distribution, we could all, just focus on the Lib Dems and Tories or on Labour and Lib Dem or whatever it is. And so even there, they're kind of a bit unwieldy, right? Whereas here, I guess, what gives you the strategic element is the fact that it's kind of that your vote depends on what happens in the other districts, right?
Right, they're more independent than if it was 3 candidates where none of the votes are independent. Independent in the sense that like I can't do anything about how the other districts vote.
Yeah. But yeah, it's I'm drawing a blank now, but I definitely in the paper have written a bit on kind of how you should think of this strategic voting versus, for example, stuff that's in the literature on previous strategic voting.
All right, I'll have a look then. Thanks.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
I could ask a question about some generality here. So you're using this Poisson distribution, and K is the key parameter there.
Mm-hmm.
But the way you present it, it seems like this should be more general than just Poisson. So is your feeling this is just for convenience, or would that be true still, the result, the voting equilibrium result, if you kind of make number of voters large,
Yeah,
with any distribution?
Yeah, no, I think, it mathematically makes everything simple. But what I do know is from some other work of Morrison's is that, he shows that basically this Poisson assumption, you would get the exact same thing if you use binomial or multinomial distributions that, as the number of voters gets large, one approximates the other. And so it's not, that gives me a bit of confidence, let's say, that it's, it's not dependent on the fact of this. It's just that using it is a known quantity that makes life easier, and we can be guaranteed that the maths fall into the way we want them to, without having kind of needless parameters flying around,
Yeah, got it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Time for more questions. We're still going to stick around a few minutes later to say goodbye and ask additional things if we want to. Anybody else?
If people are shy, we can stop recording and then move to the informal part.
Yeah, maybe people are shy. Niall, can I,
Mm-hmm.
while we're, so
I can try and turn on my video now and see if it works.
Max asked you about this d equal to 1, d equal to 3 thing, and you mentioned the double pivotality and so on. So I suppose you could actually get your hands dirty and do it for free. Exactly, right? With a double pivotality and so on. Could you get a sense of how big the difference would be with free? I mean, it's just a curiosity. I don't know whether it's worth. This would be the classic question that a referee asks, that you start cursing at the referee when you get it. But just
so let's get it first here.
Yeah. I'll wait for it from you then, Francesco, next time.
Yeah, no. I'm probably not gonna. I'm not gonna ask that question if I ever get to referee this paper.
No, I mean, it's a funny one, because I think, so it's a similar thing in that other JET paper I have and strategic voting, is that people tend to think of, when you move from a single district to multiple, that, let's go with baby steps. Let's start with 3 districts to understand what's happening, what's moving. And my sense is this is a case where it's better not to do that, right? It's better to actually just go straight with, there's lots of districts, right? And you get more traction on things like that. And the thing is that, yeah, if you went to 3 districts, right, you could, it would work conditional on you taking my assumption that voters don't take double pivotal events into account, right? But if you only had 2 districts, I mean, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but like probably 25% of the pivotal events are going to be double pivotal events, right? So it wouldn't make sense to have that assumption. Whereas if we have, I've got numbers somewhere in the paper where, like, for example, in the UK Parliament, where you have 650 seats, the amount of seat distributions that could have a double pivotal event is, 0.00007 or something like that, right? So it's kind of, the larger the size becomes, the more realistic that assumption becomes, right? And if we drop that assumption and we say, no, they do take account double pivotal events, then I'm pretty sure the welfare results are not going to go through.
Could you at least heuristically or mnemonically present it as a continuous model where the number of districts and the number of voters is continuous? I mean, of course, the pivotality there is a strange thing, but since you go in this direction with your limits, both of them, at least there's a way maybe to narratively frame it, so that it plays with the imagination of the audience.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe there is a model, in fact, with continuous. I don't know. I'm not good enough to remember.
The reason we use continuous is precisely to avoid pivotality, right? I mean,
right. Yeah. Which is exactly what gives me all the power, right? Is having pivotality. Yeah.
So it's right pivotality in the right places. You won't avoid one and have the other one.
Yeah.
We're going to stop the recording now, right? I think.